kind of lost my faith. I knew that there was something bigger. I just didn't know what that was.
Did you ever think that maybe those words came out of your mouth or in your own heart where you're thinking, wait, if God could, God would. If God was good, God would. And so when you go through something that you don't understand, something that's painful or worse, when you watch someone you love go through something painful, go through suffering, we think, well, where's God in the midst of all this? Because if God was good, he'd certainly want to do something about this. I would, as a parent. Well, maybe God isn't good, or maybe God can't do something about it. And so we get tempted to walk away from our faith. We get tempted to say, nope, then God must not exist, or if God does exist, he's not good and is not worthy of me worrying about him. And say, I'm done, and walk away. We've talked a lot over the last few weeks about friends and family that we have who've walked away from God and their faith. 35% of people under 40 claim no religious affiliation at all, no faith. And this is the major reason why. Because where is God when everything sucks? Where is God when life hurts? Why in the world do I have to watch my child struggle with this? And they just say, if God's good, I don't see it. Or maybe God's just powerless. Either way, I'm done. And they walk away. Now, we've talked over the last few weeks about what that looks like, because when you walk away from something, you walk towards something else. We've talked about what it might mean to walk clear away from God and just decide there's no God at all. We've talked about some of the things that would have to be true if that were the case, and how maybe that would lead us to a place we don't really want to be either. So over these last few weeks, we've been carving out, breaking down, and building back up this idea of what does it mean to have an adult faith, an adult relationship with God. Not a magical one that we learned in Sunday school, where God can just twinkle his nose and make everything better. But what's it like to have an adult faith in God that can go through this, and how is it that we understand this? And we kind of left our faith in childhood, and it didn't come along, it didn't develop along with us. We've been talking about this, and today is the day that we come to this, which is probably the hardest thing to wrestle with when it comes to our faith. Why in the world does God let bad things happen to good people? Why is there injustice and suffering in this world? Now, if you've gone through this, or maybe you've had a friend that's gone through this after the loss of a loved one, or maybe a loss of a job, some hardship that they went through, please understand that when you talk to them, this is not going to be a rational argument. Because when you walk away from your faith, it's an emotional thing. I mean, there's an emotional reason to flip God the bird and say, I'm out of here. There's an emotional reason behind that. So when you're talking with your family or your friends or your coworkers, understand that you are not going to argue them back to their faith. Because Christians have never, ever said that you should be a Christian because it means everything's going to go well. Never has Christianity said this is going to make that when you sign on the dotted line, all of a sudden, it's all going to be okay. Now, I got to tell you, there's a few folks you could talk to that kind of sound like that. I would suggest that you start listening to some other folks, because Jesus himself never, ever said. When we go through these things and we wonder if we should just throw our hands up and walk away, it's not the existence of God that's in question. Now, it might be his justice, and it might be his attitude. Maybe we need to have a conversation about that, but it's not his existence. It's like there's a story in the Old Testament, a guy named Jacob. He's one of our ancestors in the faith. And this guy, the story is told about how he wrestled all night long with this man. And as he's wrestling with him, trying to get the upper hand, he finally realizes that, I don't think this is just a man. He begins to think that, well, maybe this is an angel. And as the dawn is coming, the man has to leave, and finally Jacob grabs him and he says, "Tell me your name, tell me who you are, tell me why in the world I had to go through this all night long." And the man said, "You haven't been wrestling with man, you've been wrestling with your God. You've come face to face with wrestling with who God is." And the story is told that he walked away and the angel touched his hip and he walked away with a limp the rest of his life. Do you ever feel like that? You ever feel like you've come through something and, gosh, I'm different and I still sometimes bear the marks. I still sometimes have a limp when you get through. I know I've shared with some of you, if you're new, I'll share the story with you too, that I had what I call my worst day ever a few years ago. My husband had been diagnosed with colon cancer, and he'd gone through very, very difficult treatments. He was in James Cancer Center in Columbus and had surgery. And he was a couple days into his recovery, and I get a phone call. It says that my mom something's wrong. She had had cancer prior, and she was in a massive amount of pain. And my brother had taken her to the emergency room, and they said, "We don't have any beds right now." They sent her home that night, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and said, "Come back in the morning. We'll have discharged some people, and we'll give you a bed so we can get you treated, get you out of pain." So she endured a horrible, horrible night. And I left the motel from Riverside, or from James Cancer Center, to go get my mom, take her to Riverside. And I called to the hospital and said, "I'm on my way to get my mom. We'll be there in a few minutes and for her to get admitted." I said, "We're not looking for a room for your mom." I said, "Well, she was just there last night. You sent her home so that she could come back today. That's not our job. Call her doctor." And so I call her doctor and I say, "Hey, who's handling this admission, getting mom so she can get some pain medicine and figure out what's wrong?" And, "Well, we're not doing that. That's not our job. Call her oncologist." And I can tell you exactly where I was on I-270 in my red minivan, driving around 270, and I just said, "God, I don't know what's going on." And I get a call from Ken, again, who's at the James, and he said, "I need you to get back here as soon as you can. Something's wrong." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He goes, "I don't know. All I can tell you is that something's not right." I said, "Well, honey, I've got to get to mom, and I've got to find her, and I can't get a room for her, and I don't know what's going on." And he goes, "That's okay. Just get back to me as soon as you can. I don't know what's wrong." So here I am, the two people that I love the most in this world, and I can't be there for either one of them the way they need me to be. And I can't help either one of them. And the worst part of it was, I'd heard those stories. I'd heard those stories from the saints of the church that said, "And a peace washed over me." And I had this warm feeling, and I knew God was there. Do you know what I felt? Nothing. Nothing. And I said, "I would not do this to my worst enemy. If I saw somebody in this much pain and this much struggle and trying to do the right thing and couldn't, I would not sit by and watch them do this. Where are you, God?" And I heard nothing. So I said, "Okay, I don't know where you are, but you know where I am, and that's going to have to be good enough. That's going to have to be good enough." So I called the oncologist and I said, "My mom is in so much pain. Somebody needs to try to get her a room so she can get some treatment." And she says, "That's not my job." And I said, "Listen, something's wrong with my husband at another hospital. I don't know what's going on, but he needs me. My mom needs to get some care because she's in so much pain. Can you please help me? And she said, I'll see what I can do. I'll see what I can do. Now, maybe you've had a day like that. You can point to and say, that's the worst day ever. Where in the world is God in the middle of all of that? How do we even talk to somebody who's in the midst of something like that? What do we do? With that level of pain and suffering? Because Jesus never said that if we followed him, we wouldn't have days like that. So how in the world do we have this grown-up faith, this adult faith, this wrestling faith that says, I'm going to stick through this through the night and I may walk away with a limp, but I'm going to have that adult faith? I want you to look two different places. Now, I know this sounds weird, so stick with me. But this has been a long time coming to get to this place, I got to tell you. Because after that day, God and I were not on speaking terms for a very long time. And you say, but you were a pastor. Yes, I was. Yes, I was. But I wrestled. Not just days, not just weeks, months. I wrestled. I don't know where you are, but you know where I am. And that's going to have to be good enough. First, I want you to look at creation. I know that sounds weird, but remember we talked a couple weeks ago about how God created, and then what did God do on the seventh day? God rested. That's right. So if God rested, what would you expect? You would expect a world where he stopped creating. You would expect a world that was stable and predictable, that had things like the laws of motion and the laws of physics. You would expect to be able to predict things like, well, I'll say the weather, but the only way I can predict the weather is if we're having a big event, it's going to rain. That's how I can predict the weather. We've been pretty well 100% for that lately. You can predict things. You can figure out the laws of motion and the laws of physics. In fact, a lot of the modern scholars who began the modern science movement were Christians because they took this seriously. That after God got done creating, whether it was 6 days or 6 billion years, you can take your pick on that one, okay? That God stopped creating, but then what did God do? You see, while he was creating, whether it was 6 days or 6 billion years, he was initiating, he was forming, he was filling, he was creating, he was carving, he was establishing. And when he rested, he began to respond. Not initiate, respond. He began to relate. Because what's the story that happens right after this? The garden, Adam and Eve. He begins to walk with his creation. Now, whether you take this literally or not, I don't think that's the point. I think the point of this is God's trying to explain to us that he changed how he deals with us. Where before he was forming and filling and initiating and starting, now he's responding and walking with, being with and relating to his creation. Coming alongside as we walk through these things, as we have to experience these laws of physics and motion and nature. Coming alongside, as Pastor Shane said last week, like a father. Not just the best parts of our Father, but the perfect parts of Father. The perfect parts of relationship. One of the best stories that I ever heard about a dad doing this, his name was Napoleon. What an ambitious name for a kid, Napoleon. And he had a son. His second son was named Blair, and he was born without ears. He didn't develop the tissue that became ears. And when his son was born, he was determined that this child was going to have everything in life that everybody else had, including speech and hearing. And every day of this young child's life, he would go into his room and he would lay his hands on him and he would pray for him, that he would be able to hear and that he would be able to speak. Now, he made some decisions that not everybody would agree with. For example, he did not teach him sign language. And he did not let him go to a deaf school. He made them mainstream him. Can you imagine? He said, my son will hear and my son will speak. I need you to treat him like that's going to happen. He said one day when he was just a little kid, they got a Victrola. Do you remember those things? I was not alive during that point, but I've heard tell stories. No matter what you think, I was not alive for that. And he said, Blair walked over and he put his teeth, he bit down on the console where that Victrola was, and he began to hear sound because it was vibrating up his mandible, and he was able to hear because of the bone structure. Said he had to listen to this song for 2 hours because it was the first thing his son got to hear. Said he wrote to the company and he told them that story, that amazing story. And he said as Blair began to grow, he put him in school, made him, he realized that if he would put his lips right here when he talked to him, he could hear. And if his teacher would come up and stand very close to him, he'd be able to hear what she was saying. Got all the way to college. And you remember that letter that he wrote to the company? Somehow that made its way to another company that made cochlear implants, the very first cochlear implant. He was one of the very first recipients of that cochlear implant. And you know who he called? He called his mom and dad because they were the first voices he wanted to hear. Because now his hearing was 100%. He could hear and he could talk. Now, Napoleon had told Blair, he said, now, you're going to be tempted to feel like this is a disability. All of his life he had told him this. You're going to be tempted to think this is a disability. But let me tell you, he said, people are going to be extra kind to you because of this. People are going to be extra kind. They're going to go out of their way to help you because of this. And he refused to let him see this as a disability. He walked alongside of him and taught him how to be in this world, even with this. And the day came when they got the phone call. Said, Mom and Dad, I can hear. It ended up defining his life in a positive way because his dad came alongside and showed him how to make it an asset instead of a liability. Blair ended up working for the company, and he said, I will go around and I will personally invite every single person that you have who needs one of these to come and try it. I'll answer any question they have. I'll let them see how it's worked for me. I'll do everything that I can to help other people hear. And he found his calling, helping other people hear. God, Father, not a picture of our earthly Father, not just the good parts, but the perfect parts of relationship. Walking with us, responding, relating, being with us in the midst of whatever life throws at us. And it's creation that teaches us this. You see, Jesus taught us about God, something that had never, ever been uttered before. There's a scripture I want to share with you. It comes from 1 John, where it talks about why Jesus was here. It says this, Dear friends, let us love one another. For love comes from God. Everyone who has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. You see, up until the time of Jesus, if you ask the gods, or if you ask people where evil came from, they would say it was from the gods, because gods were these petty, vindictive beings who just wanted you to do what they needed you to do. They were territorial, and they just ruled over a small area like a desert or a mountain range, and that's the God. Whatever that God needed was what you did, and if you did it right, they blessed you, and if you didn't do it right, they cursed you. And you think back on it, and you think, gosh, we're so much more enlightened than that. It's like, really? When was the last time you asked yourself, wow, this is going wrong, I wonder what I did to deserve it? Or when was it like, well, actually, I can prove it. I can prove that we still have territorial gods. Put that picture up. See? This is what happens when the Browns win. Hell freezes over. Every one of you gets this picture, don't you? Because we still have this idea that there are these territorial gods, gods of brown, or maybe against, there's plenty of evidence that God's not a brown, but one way or the other, we think it has some sort of spiritual significance, doesn't it? You see, Jesus is the one who came to say, for God so loved the world. Not just my corner of it. Not just the people who look like me and act like me. And God loved the world. Not expecting to do everything he wanted, loved them. This was a brand new concept that Jesus gave us. To understand that God is love. God is love. We look at creation and we realize that God is walking with us through these things. That we can't magically make them go away. He won't magically make them go away. But he will walk with us as a father through them. Now, the second thing we need to look at is the cross. We look at creation to understand how God is in the world, and then we look at the cross. Last week we talked about the God of Jesus showing us what God is like, but it is a cross that helps us understand where God is in the midst of suffering and pain. You see, remember when Jesus was in the garden and he said, hey God, can you do something about this? Isn't there any other way we can do this? What was he saying? He's saying, man, I want that Sunday school God to be true. I want God to be able to take this away from me so I don't have to wrestle through it. Now, I know that a lot of people think that Jesus, when he got to this point, he just knew what was going to happen. And he's just going to hang out for 3 days, maybe play a little euchre while he's sitting there waiting for the resurrection, That somehow he's walking into all of this and he knew what was going to go on. I submit to you that is not true. That Jesus walked through his life and through his death exactly the way we have to, with faith in God or not, and the choice is ours. That when Jesus faced the end of his life, he had to face it with the same faith we do, that somehow this is not the end. That somehow this is not all there is. That somehow love is stronger than death. It is more real than death. That this isn't all there is. And when God says, I can't magically just make this go away. If I do, everybody's lost. Everything is lost. He said, okay, your will be done. Okay, I'll wrestle. Okay, it may hurt and I may have a limp when I'm done. I will hold on. It is the cross that says that God's position is to walk with us and transform the pain that we go through. Because God will not take it away, but God will transform it, and he will never waste it. He will never waste pain. The friends that you have that have gone through this, family members, maybe you yourself, you know what? You don't need a meme. You don't need God just needed another flower in his garden. That's why he took your loved one. Please, don't insult me. Your friends need to know. You need to know. Your family needs to know that God is there. And let me tell you, when you're in the midst of your worst day ever, you may not feel it. Thanks to a couple very generous, gracious people in my life, I came through that wrestling match. God, I don't understand why on my worst day ever I couldn't feel you. It took a couple years, but I got to the place that I wrestled through the place to where I said, I don't get it, but it's okay. And I finally heard the voice of God again. Not audible, of course, but this impression that came to me. I said, God, I don't get why you would leave me without a sense of your presence on my worst day ever. And this is what he said. I'm the one who sent the nurse that came through for you. I'm the one who sent the nurse who came through for you. But why couldn't I feel your presence? He said, Vic, he calls me Vic, by the way. He said, Vic, you were in shock. You were never going to be able to feel my presence or anything else in that moment because you were in shock. Your body couldn't feel me, but I was there. I sent the nurse. I sent the nurse. Your friends who are struggling with this, they don't need memes. They don't need pat answers. They don't need little flowery whatevers. They need you to wrap your arms around them and say, even if you can't feel God, you can feel my arms around you, and I am with you. And I am a physical demonstration, a visual demonstration that God is here with you. And God will not waste your pain. He will not waste your pain. You may limp when you're done. You may have a relationship with God that is an adult one instead of the one you had in Sunday school. But I'm here to tell you, you are not alone. I'm here to demonstrate you are not alone. Because God is love. And if you can't feel it, I'm going to be the one to remind you of it today. Now, I don't know where you are. I don't know where you've been in the midst of all this. I know there's at least one person here who's walked away, and you're sitting here, but only because they promised you lunch afterwards. It's the only way you could get anything to eat. That's why you're here. You know what? That's okay. I also know that some of you have friends and family and coworkers who have walked away because of this, or are considering walking away because of it. And I know that God has you in their life for this purpose. I sent the nurse, and God is sending you to be that for somebody, to help them hold on to their faith, to show them that Sunday school Jesus has to grow up, and you're going to help them as they wrestle with it and they wrestle through it. And I want to pray for you today. And if you're the one wrestling, that you know God is with you. And if your friend is the one that's wrestling, that you are the person God's going to send to them to physically let them know He's there. Let's pray. God, sometimes it is so difficult to feel your presence. Sometimes sometimes we just wonder why in the world you'd leave us in the midst of this, why you'd make us go through it in the first place, and why you'd leave us in it. To add insult to injury, it's sometimes hard to feel your presence through it. But in this time, in this space right now, would you remind us that you are love, that you are the perfection of Father, the perfection of relationship, and that you walk with us through this no matter what. And when we can't feel your presence, would you send someone to us to be that nurse, to be that one that comes through, to be that physical representation of your presence. And for those of us who have wrestled with you all night long and we still limp from time to time as a result of it, would you help us to be that for somebody else? Help us to put away our memes and our flowery thoughts and allow people to wrestle with an adult faith. And even though it doesn't help us predict a lot, it does help us to find purpose and meaning. Thank you for being the kind of God that doesn't waste pain. Would you help us to be the people who can stand with those who are in that pain? In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Our final song today is one that we have to sing with faith. Sometimes we feel it and sometimes we don't, but this is one where we just simply say, "You are God," and that will be enough. Would you stand with us as we sing?